the Boston Massacre, though actually we're going to go to the setup for this event first. So the thing is, even with the repeal of the Stamp and parts of the Sugar Act, Britain has not given up taxing the colonies. And in fact, they're going to go on to pass a whole new set of taxes known as the Townshend duties in 1767. Now, these acts were they were basically Charles Townshend's idea, thus the Townshend Acts, and he really thought that he understood the colonies, and he really understood that Parliament still wanted to tax the colonies. And so the Townshend Duty Acts were basically imposing new duties or external taxes because Charles Townshend believed the colonists would be willing to accept these kind of external taxes, but he made sure there were no direct or internal taxes. Now, these duties are going to cover like tea, paper, paint, lead, and glass. And on top of that, to ensure that they're collected, the British are going to add a new board of customs commissioners for America and basically locate the HQ for this in Boston. Now we are going to see some incidents come out of this pretty quickly. We're going to see officials are going to be a lot more diligent than their predecessors about collecting these duties and everything like that. And in fact, they're going to use a technicality to entrap a prominent merchant in South Carolina known as Henry Lawrence. And then others are going to go on to harass a wealthy Boston merchant by the name of John Hancock. Now, John Hancock, if you're going, that name sounds familiar, he's the one that eventually signs the Declaration of Independence, like way bigger than everyone else. So the thing is, make no mistake, John Hancock definitely smuggled items at various times over his career. But in this particular case, the accusations against him were false. And this is going to spark riot in Boston. Quick note, if you're ever trying to remember where something happens in the lead up to the American Revolution, your best guess is Boston because a lot of stuff happens there. Britain is going to respond to this riot in Boston, though, in 1768 by sending more troops to be stationed there. So what happens is the soldiers are going to be there amid this mounting hostility for the next year and a half. So we're already setting the stage. Now, when it comes to the Townshend crisis, or the Townshend Acts, really, we're going to see resistance against them throughout the colonies. The purpose of these duties was basically to pay for the costs of the government in the colonies, including things like the salaries of like governors and judges of the different colonies. Now, Americans saw this as dangerous because they felt like it was the role of their own assemblies to raise revenue for these costs, rather than some external, or at least what they viewed as external government that was Parliament. And so the Townshend Act to them is threatening to undermine their own legislature's authority in the American colonies. Now, we're not going to see in this response any kind of like Stamp Act Congress because British officials are going to bar assemblies from sending delegates to such a meeting. So instead, they do what they've done before. A non-importation movement, an extremely effective non-importation movement. It was so big and so important that you even see some Americans actually would threaten violators of this general boycott with like physical violence, though actually there was very few disturbances occurred. You get things like subscription lists that people would sign that would bind them to only buy goods that had been made within the American colonies. Suddenly, like wearing homespun clothing became like, a moral virtue. More than anything, this is going to forge a sense or a common purpose and trust amongst all the different American colonists that participate. I mean, remember, it wasn't that long ago that they couldn't even, put together the Albany Plan of Union because of this distrust between all the different American colonies. And now we see this intercolonial union that definitely goes across colony boundaries. It creates this like sense of belonging and to some sort of like larger community of fellow Americans. Nothing brings people together like a common enemy. This community is very much real enough and large enough that it mobilizes many ordinary Americans to sharply reduce their imports from Britain. And in fact, it was so effective by 1770, the Prime Minister of England, Lord North, is going to concede that the Townshend duties were more counterproductive than helpful. More than anything, they had interfered with trade, and in the end, they are going to repeal most of them, but they leave the duty on tea. It's a big important because maybe you already know what this is going to lead to later. This really was the symbolic equivalent of like the Declaratory Act. It's asserting that Parliament does have that right to tax the colonies. And this brings us to the Boston Massacre. Now, before I talk about the Boston Massacre, I want you to take a second and honestly, please feel free to pause this video in just a second. And I want you to make note of what sticks out to you in this engraving. This was a silver engraving, so if you do go like Google search it online, you'll actually see it's colored slightly different depending on different newspapers, but think about the colors that are used. Think about how it is drawn. Think about what kind of scene it is portraying. So go ahead and pause if you want to make note of things. And now I'm going to go ahead and tell you about the Boston Massacre, though this is part of our discussion, so please be making sure that you go into that discussion to talk about it. The same day that Parliament is going to propose to rescind most of the Townshend duties, March 5th of 1770, British troops will fire unlawfully on American civilians in Boston in an event that comes to be known as the Boston Massacre. This occurs after months of increasing friction between the townspeople and the British troops that had been stationed in the city. This also occurred after angry and frightened British soldiers basically fired on a crowd that actually had been pelting them with sticks and stones, and in the process would kill 5 men, and thus they have to be held accountable in some way. Now, to tell you exactly what happened here, I'm actually going to fast forward to the Boston Massacre trials. There's going to be 2 particular trials that come out of this incident. The first of which is the trial of Captain Preston, who actually you can see pictured here on the far right. Now, what was critically important to this trial was that he gave the command for his troops to fire unlawfully on a crowd of American civilians. The problem is, no one exactly knew who said fire. There was one individual that came out saying that, no, I was only mere feet away from Captain Preston, and I can say without a doubt that Captain Preston did not order for his troops to fire. And then there's the question of maybe the soldiers themselves were lamenting, why can't we fire on these colonists? And then there's the question of the crowd and the colonists themselves might have egged on the British troops, fire, just fire on us. And then to make matters even more complicated, someone who had nothing to do with this entire moment might have said fire as well, because when this trouble started happening and brewing, people came to the scene and they were summoned by bells ringing out. Well, the reason bells rang out, the thing is, when bells rang out at this time, it was to warn people that there was an actual fire. And as Boston was predominantly made out of wood, you want as many people to come running as quickly as possible. So there might have been people on streets just over yelling, "Fire, fire, where's the fire?" On top of that, another individual could say that Captain Preston indeed wasn't actually behind his troops like we see here, but he was in the center, and he was trying, it was more of, a brawl-like state, and he was actually trying to get his men to back off, and if he had told his men to fire, he could have very easily been, caught up in the crossfire. And so, due to all of this evidence, Captain Preston is going to be acquitted of all charges. But now things look rather bleak for the troops who will be put on trial. Because A, someone has to pay for what has happened, and they did shoot unlawfully and kill people, especially because they hadn't been given an official command by their captain. Now, first of all, the troops that are going to be charged, they're going to be charged with manslaughter, not murder, because they hadn't, it wasn't premeditated in any way, but they did, after all, kill someone. But even those who are convicted are not going to get a capital sentence. And part of this is because of actual testimony given by Patrick Carr, one of the victims of the Boston Massacre. Patrick Carr was a young man, and he died from wounds from the Boston Massacre. And you're going, wait a second, how did he testify if he died? Because the trials happened months later. But basically, Patrick Carr didn't die right away from his wounds, and he was able to talk to those who were attending to him. And he basically admitted to them that they, being the Americans, went in a crowd and they were really looking for a fight. And he also admitted they got the worst of it, but he basically admitted his group on some level was in the fault. Now, normally, the law wouldn't allow this kind of hearsay to be put forward in a court of law because it's secondhand. But there's an exception to this rule. Basically, if a person made a deathbed statement, it has higher priority than the hearsay rule and therefore would be allowed as testimony in a court of law. Because the idea is, why would anyone lie on their deathbed when they're about to go meet their maker and everything like that? And so because of this, we're going to see that the troops don't get that capital sentence. And they're also, from there, only 2 of them are going to be charged through. This is going to be Kilroy and Montgomery. And they're going to be specifically charged with the specific manslaughter of individuals. For instance, Montgomery is actually charged with the manslaughter specifically of Crispus Attucks, who was a half Indian, half black man, which is a really big deal because it shows that already before America has even been made, there's this institution of a fair trial that convicted someone of killing a black man in American history. So it's a really, really big deal. Now, that being said, there was a loophole from the 1100s that they're going to also use in this trial, that basically if you were some sort of churchman, priest, or monk, then the church's rule could protect you, and in this case, they're going to indict this, and the church is going to claim authority over the trial. They're going to really be shipped back to England for their punishment. Well, of course, the church isn't going to have any kind of death penalty. At worst, they can do is kick them out of the church. And what they really did is actually they are going to brand an M on the thumbs of these 2 individuals. And the idea is that next time, if this was ever to happen again in their lives, they wouldn't get off so easily because they've already been branded once for being a murderer, is the idea. But it's a really big deal that we get out of this incident a very fair trial. And I actually want to point this out now that I've talked about it. The big defending prosecutor, or not prosecutor, the defense attorney for this trial, who defended Captain Preston and the British soldiers, was John Adams, a future president of the United States of America. So you can see that this important of a fair and legal trial already being interwoven into America's like tapestry and history, so to speak.